2:30 in the morning. Crystal chandeliers blazed over the abandoned Sterling Corporation ballroom, illuminating champagne bottles scattered like fallen soldiers across marble floors. Connor Mitchell maneuvered his cleaning cart through the wreckage of corporate celebration, the squeak of wheels echoing in cathedral-like silence. Then he saw her, a woman collapsed in an executive chair, black evening gown twisted around her frame, golden hair spilling across her face like liquid silk hiding tears. Empty champagne bottle rolled at her feet. She lifted her head, revealing smeared mascara and eyes that held the hollow desperation of someone drowning in plain sight. "Why don't you take me home?" The words cut through the silence, raw and broken. Connor stepped closer, recognizing something familiar in her voice, the same plea he'd whispered to empty rooms after burying his wife. "Just the two of us," he found himself asking. She laughed bitterly, wiping her cheek. "Yeah, just me. Always just me." But Connor heard something else beneath her words, a pain that mirrored his own sleepless nights. Connor removed his work jacket and draped it over her bare shoulders. The fabric swallowed her small frame, making her look more vulnerable than any CEO should ever appear. "I'm Connor," he said gently. "Night shift janitor. And you are?" She looked up at him with those haunting blue eyes, as if seeing him for the first time. "Victoria Sterling," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a confession she'd rather not make. "I own this building, and I hate every inch of it." Her voice cracked on the last word, revealing cracks in what Connor assumed was usually an impenetrable facade. 3 years ago, Connor had been someone completely different. He'd played guitar in small venues across Manhattan, writing folk songs about love and hope, dreaming of recording an album that would touch people's souls. Sarah had been his biggest supporter, sitting in coffee shops for hours while he performed, her eyes bright with pride and possibilities. Then cancer came like a thief in the night, stealing not just his wife but his music, his dreams, everything that made him who he was. Now he scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans in buildings owned by people like Victoria Sterling, trading his guitar calluses for cleaning solution burns on his hands. Victoria had inherited Sterling Corporation at 30, thrust into a world of boardroom politics and shareholder demands before she'd learned how to navigate her own life. 5 years of 16-hour days, missed birthdays, cancelled vacations, and relationships that crumbled under the weight of her responsibilities. Her parents viewed her as an asset to be optimized. The board saw her as a young woman who needed constant proving, and everyone else wanted something from her bank account. She'd learned to smile at charity galas while feeling utterly hollow inside, to make small talk about quarterly reports while forgetting what genuine conversation felt like. "Do you ever feel like you're dying a little more each day?" Victoria asked suddenly, her words hanging in the chandelier light like smoke. Connor gripped his cleaning cart handle tighter, the question hitting too close to home. "Yeah," he admitted. "When Sarah died, I thought I'd never feel alive again." Victoria nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a shared secret. "I'm dying every day, but I'm still breathing. 5 a.m. wake-ups, 11 p.m. bedtimes, weekends filled with board meetings. I'm 35, and I've never had a single day that belonged just to me." The admission seemed to surprise her more than him. Connor helped Victoria down to the parking garage, her heels clicking against concrete like a broken metronome. She pointed to a black Mercedes, its paint job probably worth more than Connor made in 6 months. As he drove through empty Manhattan streets, Victoria stared out the window at a city that never truly slept. 500 people at tonight's party," she said quietly. "But when they saw me drinking alone, not one person asked if I was okay." Connor glanced at her through the rearview mirror, seeing not the powerful CEO, but a woman drowning in her own success. "I haven't been to a party since Sarah's funeral," he replied. "People look at widowers like they don't know what to say." The red light gave them both a moment to sit with their shared loneliness. 1 week later, Connor was cleaning the 39th floor when he spotted Victoria at the hallway coffee machine at 2 in the morning. She was jabbing the buttons repeatedly, but the machine displayed an error message in angry red letters. "Let me help," Connor offered, appearing beside her like a ghost in work clothes. He tapped the machine in a specific spot, and coffee began flowing into her cup. "You're still working this late?" Victoria asked, genuine surprise coloring her voice. "Night shift runs from 11 to 7. Connor explained. "What about you? Shouldn't CEOs be sleeping in silk pajamas by now?" Victoria almost smiled at that. "I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see spreadsheets and profit margins." They stood drinking coffee in comfortable silence, the building's night sounds creating an oddly intimate atmosphere, the hum of computers on standby, the distant whoosh of elevators moving between empty floors, the gentle buzz of fluorescent lights. It all felt like a lullaby for the perpetually exhausted. "Did you get home safely last week?" Connor asked, remembering how fragile she'd seemed in the ballroom. "Thanks to you, yes, and I'm sorry you saw me like that." Victoria's cheeks flushed pink, embarrassment making her look younger. "Everyone has moments they'd rather forget," Connor said simply. "The important thing is that someone was there to help." For the first time in months, Victoria felt less alone in her glass tower. 2 weeks after their first encounter, Victoria found herself trapped in an elevator between the 34th and 35th floors. The lights flickered once before settling into an ominous dim glow, and panic clawed at her throat like a living thing. She pressed the emergency button repeatedly, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "Help me! Someone please help!" Her voice echoed in the small metal box, bouncing back at her like mockery. From somewhere outside, she heard footsteps, then a familiar voice. "Ms. Sterling, it's Connor. I'm calling maintenance right now." His calm tone cut through her rising panic like a lighthouse beam through fog. I can't breathe in here!" Victoria gasped, pressing her back against the elevator wall as if she could somehow meld with it and escape. Connor sat down right outside the elevator doors, his voice steady and reassuring. "Talk to me about something. Anything. What did you want to be when you were little?" Victoria tried to focus on his words instead of the walls closing in around her. "A piano teacher," she whispered. "I wanted to teach kids how to make music." Connor smiled, though she couldn't see it. "That's beautiful. My son Leo is 9, and he's learning guitar. Kids have this amazing way of finding joy in simple things, don't they?" For 30 minutes, Connor painted pictures with words, stories about Leo's first attempts at playing guitar, his gap-toothed grin when he finally mastered a chord, the way his eyes lit up when music made sense. When the elevator doors finally opened, Victoria stepped out on shaky legs and immediately grabbed Connor's arm for support. Her usual composure had completely cracked, revealing someone much more human than the polished executive who commanded boardrooms. "Thank you," she breathed, still gripping his arm like an anchor. "You stayed." There was wonder in her voice, as if the concept of someone remaining during her moment of vulnerability was entirely foreign. Connor studied her face, seeing traces of the scared little girl she must have been. "Of course I stayed. That's what people do for each other." But even as he said it, Connor realized that maybe not everyone in Victoria's world operated by the same rules. 3 weeks into their unusual friendship, Connor made a decision that surprised even him. Sunday afternoon found him in Central Park with Leo, teaching his son guitar on their favorite bench near the pond. Leo's enthusiasm more than made up for his lack of skill, and his laughter drew smiles from passing joggers and dog walkers. Connor had hoped Victoria might accidentally walk by. She'd mentioned living on the Upper East Side, but he hadn't expected to feel quite so nervous about the possibility. When a familiar figure appeared on the path, his heart did something complicated in his chest. "Dad, is that the lady from your work?" Leo asked with the unfiltered curiosity that only 9-year-olds possessed. Victoria approached hesitantly, clearly unsure of her welcome in this family moment. She wore jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual business attire, looking almost like a different person entirely. "Connor, I hope I'm not intruding. I was just walking and—" She trailed off, her eyes moving between father and son with something that looked like longing. "Leo, this is Victoria. Victoria, my son, Leo." Connor watched as his son immediately brightened, possessing none of his father's complicated feelings about class differences. "Dad used to be a musician," Leo announced proudly, as if this was the most important information in the world. "He writes the most beautiful songs about Mom." Victoria's eyes widened with genuine interest, a spark appearing that Connor had never seen before. "You were a professional musician?" she asked, settling onto the bench beside them as naturally as if she belonged there. Connor felt heat creep up his neck. "Just coffee shop gigs, nothing fancy. I had to give it up when—" He gestured vaguely, not wanting to explain death and financial responsibility in front of his son. Victoria nodded with understanding, not pushing for details that were clearly painful. "Play something for Victoria, Dad," Leo insisted, thrusting the guitar toward Connor with the confidence that only comes from unconditional love. Connor hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly as they found the familiar frets. It had been months since he'd played for anyone besides Leo, and certainly never for someone whose opinion might actually matter to him. The melody that emerged was soft and melancholic, a song he'd written about Sarah during her final weeks, about loving someone so much that you'd trade places with them without hesitation. Victoria listened with tears gathering in her eyes, understanding without words that she was hearing something sacred. When the last note faded, Leo clapped enthusiastically while Victoria sat in respectful silence. "That was extraordinary," she finally whispered. "You wrote that?" Connor nodded, suddenly self-conscious about the worn guitar and the simple tune. "For my wife, about what it feels like to love someone more than your own life." Victoria's breath caught, emotion flickering across her features like shadows. No one has ever loved me like that," she admitted so quietly that Connor almost missed it. The confession hung between them, loaded with years of loneliness and corporate isolation. As Leo ran off to chase pigeons, Connor and Victoria found themselves alone on the bench, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the park. "Do you have any dreams left?" Victoria asked suddenly. "Besides keeping Leo happy and healthy?" Connor considered the question seriously, watching his son's carefree laughter. "I used to dream about recording an album. Silly, really." Victoria shook her head firmly. "It's not silly. I used to dream about learning piano, but my father said it was a waste of time for someone in my position." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd given up pieces of themselves for survival and responsibility. Could you teach me something? Just a chord or two?" Victoria's request came out hesitant, as if she expected rejection. Connor looked at her manicured hands, so different from his work-roughened fingers, and nodded. "Here, place your fingers like this." As he guided her hand to the correct position, their skin touched briefly, sending an unexpected jolt through both of them. Victoria's first attempt at the chord was clumsy, producing a muffled sound that made Leo giggle from across the grass. But her second try was better, and by the third, she was smiling with genuine delight. 1 month after their first meeting in the ballroom, Connor's world shifted on its axis in the worst possible way. He arrived at work Monday morning to find a pink slip in his locker and his security access card deactivated. "Budget cuts," his supervisor explained with the practiced indifference of someone who'd delivered this news many times before. "Nothing personal, Mitchell. Company's restructuring the cleaning staff." Connor stared at the termination letter, his mind racing through mortgage payments and Leo's school expenses, grocery bills and medical insurance premiums that he could no longer afford. What Connor didn't know was that Margaret Ashworth, Sterling Corporation's ruthless human resources director, had been watching. She'd noticed Connor's conversations with Victoria, documented their elevator encounter, and compiled a report that painted their interactions as inappropriate fraternization between executive and support staff. Margaret had presented her findings to the board of directors with surgical precision, suggesting that Connor's employment posed a liability risk to company morale and Victoria's professional reputation. The board had agreed immediately. Removing the problem was simpler than addressing the complexity of human connection across class lines. Later that afternoon, Connor decided to tell Victoria about his termination in person. He owed her that much, at least. Using his knowledge of the building's security patterns, he made his way to the executive floor one last time. Through the glass walls of the conference room, he saw Victoria seated at an enormous mahogany table surrounded by men in expensive suits. On the wall-mounted screen, a presentation displayed Staff Optimization Initiative, Phase 1 complete. Connor's name appeared on a list of terminated employees, marked with a red X that looked disturbingly final. What destroyed Connor wasn't just seeing his name on the termination list. It was watching Victoria's face as Margaret Ashworth discussed removing problematic staff members who showed poor judgment in workplace relationships. Victoria sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, offering no objection as Connor's employment was discussed like a line item to be eliminated. She even nodded when Margaret suggested that maintaining professional boundaries prevents these uncomfortable situations. Connor felt something break inside his chest, a sound like guitar strings snapping under too much pressure. That evening, Connor waited outside the Sterling building until Victoria emerged at her usual time of 11:30. She looked surprised to see him, then immediately guilty, which told him everything he needed to know. "Connor, what are you doing here?" Her voice carried a nervous edge that hadn't been there during their previous conversations. "I came to say goodbye," Connor replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I got terminated today. Funny thing is, I saw my name on your presentation screen this afternoon." Victoria's face went pale in the streetlight, her carefully constructed composure cracking like ice under pressure. "I can explain," Victoria started, but Connor held up his hand to stop her. "Explain what? That you were in the room when they decided to fire me? That you sat there while they called me a problematic employee?" His voice remained steady, but Victoria could hear the hurt underneath. "You didn't say a single word in my defense, did you?" The question hit its target, and Victoria flinched as if he'd physically struck her. "It wasn't that simple," she whispered. "The board was already suspicious about our friendship. I was trying to protect both of us." But even as she said it, the excuse sounded hollow in the night air. Connor reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, his termination letter. "They said I showed poor judgment in workplace relationships. I guess they were right about the poor judgment part." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but Connor felt nothing but numbness where his heart used to be. I actually thought you cared about me as a person. Not as a janitor, not as someone beneath your social class, but as Connor." He shook his head, laughing bitterly. 3 years ago I lost my wife. Today I lost my job. But somehow losing your friendship hurts just as much." 2 weeks later, Connor discovered the true scope of his professional devastation. His termination from Sterling Corporation had somehow poisoned his prospects at every other major company in the city. Applications that should have resulted in interviews were met with polite rejections or, worse, complete silence. Phone calls to former contacts in the building maintenance industry revealed an uncomfortable truth. Word had spread that Connor Mitchell was trouble, someone who didn't understand proper boundaries with management. The invisible blacklist was more effective than any official documentation. Meanwhile, Connor's financial situation deteriorated rapidly. His unemployment benefits wouldn't cover half of his monthly expenses, and his savings account, never substantial to begin with, dwindled with frightening speed. Leo noticed the changes first. Cheaper groceries, cancelled weekend activities, the worried expression that Connor tried to hide behind forced smiles. "Are we poor now, Dad?" Leo asked one evening over a dinner of instant ramen and canned vegetables. The innocent question hit Connor like a physical blow, reminding him how completely his life had unraveled in just 14 days. On a Wednesday afternoon, desperation drove Connor to East 48th Street's Music and Arts store. The guitar that Sarah had given him for their second anniversary, a 1967 Martin acoustic with mother-of-pearl inlays, represented his last asset of any real value. Connor had carried it through late-night coffee shop performances, basement jam sessions, and countless hours of writing songs about love and loss. Now it would pay for another month of rent and groceries, trading his musical soul for basic survival. He stood outside the store for 20 minutes, gathering the courage to walk inside and surrender his past. The store's bell chimed as Connor entered, the familiar smell of wood polish and metal strings triggering a rush of bittersweet memories. He was examining his guitar one final time when he heard a voice that made his blood freeze. "Connor, what are you doing here?" Victoria Sterling stood near the classical guitar section, dressed in casual clothes that probably cost more than Connor's monthly salary. Her face showed genuine shock, followed immediately by something that looked like guilt or shame. For a moment, neither of them moved, the weight of their shared history filling the space between them like smoke. "Selling my guitar," Connor replied flatly, not bothering to soften the sharp edges of his voice. "Turns out unemployment doesn't pay enough to cover rent and food." Victoria's eyes moved to the Martin in his hands, understanding immediately what this sacrifice meant to him. "Connor, I can help. Let me—" But he cut her off with a laugh that held no humor whatsoever. "Help? Like you helped me keep my job?" The words hit their target, and Victoria stepped back as if he'd slapped her. "That's not fair. You don't understand the position I was in." The shop owner, recognizing Victoria from newspaper photos, approached with the kind of obsequious attention reserved for extremely wealthy customers. "Ms. Sterling, what an honor. Are you here for our charity instrument drive?" Victoria's face flushed deep red, but she didn't correct the assumption. Connor felt another piece of his heart break. "Of course," Victoria murmured. "For underprivileged children." The casual lie, delivered so smoothly, confirmed everything Connor had suspected about their relationship. He'd been a charity case all along, a project to make Victoria feel better about her privileged existence. "Perfect timing, then," Connor said, his voice deadly quiet. "You can buy my guitar for your charity drive. Help some other underprivileged person." He placed the Martin on the counter between them, like evidence in a trial. This is what happens when CEOs play games with working people's lives. We lose everything that matters to us. Victoria reached toward the guitar, then stopped, her hand hovering inches from the polished wood. "Connor, please, let me explain what really happened." But Connor was already walking towards the door, leaving behind not just his instrument, but any remaining illusion that their connection had been real. Outside the music store, Victoria caught up with Connor at a red light. "You have to listen to me," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. The board found out about our friendship and threatened to have me removed as CEO if I didn't prove my ability to make objective decisions about personnel. Connor shook off her touch, his face a mask of controlled anger. So, you chose your job over a human being you claimed to care about. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but Connor felt no sympathy. Do you know what they called me in that meeting? A liability to executive reputation. Not a person, not even an employee, just a liability. I tried to save your position. Victoria insisted, desperation creeping into her voice. I thought if I could prove that terminating you was a business decision rather than personal, I could protect you from worse consequences. Connor stared at her in disbelief. Worse consequences? Victoria, I can't find work anywhere in this city. Your company didn't just fire me, they destroyed my ability to support my son. The weight of his words settled between them like a stone in still water. Every application I submit gets rejected without explanation. Every contact I call suddenly has nothing available. Your board didn't just want me gone, they wanted me to disappear completely. Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. I know, she whispered. I found out about the blacklist last week. Margaret Ashworth has been making calls to other companies, warning them about inappropriate employee behavior. Connor felt the last of his restraint slip away. And you let it happen. You sat in your ivory tower while they systematically destroyed my life. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I trusted you, Victoria. I actually thought a CEO could see me as an equal, as someone worth knowing. But I was just your slumming experiment, wasn't I? The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Victoria opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again, realizing that her actions had already provided Connor's answer. That's not... I never thought of you that way, she stammered. But Connor was already turning away, his shoulders set with the finality of someone who'd heard enough lies to last a lifetime. Goodbye, Victoria. Enjoy spending your family's money on charity drives and underprivileged instruments. Maybe it'll help you sleep better at night. He walked away without looking back, leaving Victoria standing alone on the sidewalk with tears streaming down her face. 2 months passed in a blur of rejection letters and dwindling bank account balances. Connor finally found work with a small delivery company that asked few questions and paid wages that barely covered basic expenses. The job required him to wear a uniform and drive a van throughout Manhattan, delivering packages to the same buildings where he'd once worked as maintenance staff. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was still serving the wealthy, just from a different angle. Leo tried to hide his disappointment when they had to cancel his guitar lessons, but Connor saw the sadness in his son's eyes. On a Tuesday afternoon, Connor's delivery route took him through the Upper East Side's wealthiest neighborhood. Traffic moved slowly through streets lined with townhouses that cost more than most people earned in their entire lives. Connor was checking his next delivery address when he heard the screech of brakes and the sickening crunch of metal against concrete. 50 yards ahead, a black Mercedes had jumped the curb and slammed into a decorative light post, steam rising from its crumpled hood like smoke signals of distress. Connor pulled over immediately, his training from volunteer firefighting classes kicking in before his emotions could catch up. The Mercedes was severely damaged, its driver's side door buckled inward. Through the spider-webbed windshield, Connor could see a woman slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling from her forehead onto the deployed airbag. It took him several seconds to recognize Victoria Sterling, unconscious and potentially dying in the wreckage of her expensive car. For one terrible moment, Connor hesitated. This woman had destroyed his career, his financial stability, his ability to provide for his son. But Connor's fundamental decency won out over his anger. He called 911 while running toward the crashed Mercedes, adrenaline overriding any thoughts of revenge or justice. The driver's door was jammed, but the passenger side opened with some effort. Victoria was breathing but unresponsive, her usually perfect appearance now marred by blood and the chemical smell of deployed airbags. "Victoria, can you hear me?" Connor asked, checking her pulse and looking for signs of serious injury. Her breathing was steady but shallow, and she showed no response to his voice or touch. The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes, professionally efficient as they stabilized Victoria and prepared her for transport to Mount Sinai Hospital. One of them found a pill bottle in Victoria's purse, prescription sleeping medication, nearly empty. "Looks like she took about 15 pills," the paramedic said grimly. This wasn't an accident. Connor felt his stomach drop as the implications sank in. Victoria hadn't crashed her car due to reckless driving or mechanical failure. She'd deliberately consumed enough sleeping pills to lose consciousness while behind the wheel, turning her Mercedes into a suicide weapon. At the hospital, Connor found himself in the uncomfortable position of being Victoria's only emergency contact. Her parents were traveling in Europe, her assistant explained, and there were no other personal relationships listed in her files. Connor sat in the waiting room for 3 hours, questioning why he'd stayed when he could have simply driven away after the ambulance arrived. A doctor finally emerged with news. Victoria would survive, but she'd come dangerously close to permanent brain damage from the drug overdose. She'd been conscious enough to write something before losing control of the car, a letter found in her purse, sealed but unaddressed. The nurse handed Connor the envelope, assuming he was Victoria's boyfriend or husband. Inside, he found 3 pages of handwritten text that made his hands shake as he read. "Connor," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I'll finally be free from the prison I built around myself. I want you to know that loving you was the only real thing I've ever experienced, even though I destroyed it through my own cowardice." The words blurred as Connor's eyes filled with unexpected tears, his anger temporarily displaced by the raw pain in Victoria's confession. "I need you to understand what really happened." The letter continued. "When the board discovered our friendship, they didn't just threaten my job. They threatened to destroy Sterling Corporation's charitable foundation, which provides education funding for 12,000 underprivileged children. They said if I showed emotional compromise regarding personnel decisions, they'd vote me out and dismantle every program I'd built to help people." Connor's breathing became shallow as he read, understanding for the first time the impossible position Victoria had faced. "I thought I could save both you and the foundation by making your termination look like a business decision rather than personal favoritism." The letter's final page contained the truth that Connor had been too angry to see. "I tried to protect you by creating a paper trail that made your firing seem objective and professional. I never knew about Margaret's blacklist campaign until weeks later. When I confronted her, she said the board had authorized reputation management to prevent future incidents. By then, the damage was done, and I realized that everything I'd tried to do to save you had only made things worse." Victoria's handwriting became increasingly erratic as the pills took effect. "I can't live with the knowledge that my cowardice destroyed the only person who ever saw me as human. I love you, Connor. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to fight for us." When Victoria regained consciousness 18 hours later, Connor was sitting beside her hospital bed. She looked surprised to see him, then immediately ashamed, as if his presence made her suicide attempt seem even more dramatic and self-indulgent. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube. Connor held up her letter, its pages now creased from multiple readings. "Because I couldn't let you die thinking I hated you." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but Connor continued before she could speak. "I did hate you. For weeks, I blamed you for everything that went wrong in my life. You should hate me," Victoria replied, turning her face away from him. "I had the power to protect you, and I chose the easy path instead." Connor studied her profile, seeing exhaustion and defeat in every line of her face. You chose 12,000 children over one man. That's not cowardice. That's an impossible decision that no one should have to make. Victoria's head snapped back toward him, surprise replacing shame in her expression. You read the whole letter? Connor nodded. 3 times. I needed to understand what really happened before I decided whether to stay or walk away. For several minutes, they sat in silence, punctuated only by the steady beeping of Victoria's heart monitor. I tried to resign after your termination, Victoria finally said. But my contract includes a clause that prevents me from leaving before age 40 without forfeiting all family assets to distant relatives. If I'd quit, they would have closed the foundation and fired 3,000 employees to maximize short-term profits. Connor absorbed this information slowly, his anger gradually being replaced by a more complex understanding of corporate power structures and family obligations. So you're trapped, he said. It wasn't a question. Victoria laughed bitterly. Golden handcuffs. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, but I can't make a single decision that's truly my own. She looked at Connor with eyes that seemed older than her 35 years. Do you know what's funny? I've been preparing for my own death for months, writing instructions for the foundation's management, setting up trusts for the educational programs. I had everything planned except I didn't expect you to be the one who found me. Connor felt something shift in his chest, anger giving way to a different emotion he wasn't ready to name. Victoria, Connor said quietly. Why did you want to die? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Victoria closed her eyes, gathering courage for an honesty she'd never attempted before. Because I finally understood what love feels like, and I knew I'd destroyed any chance of keeping it. Her words were barely audible. Every day since you lost your job, I've watched myself become smaller and more cowardly. I couldn't face a future where I had unlimited power, but no one who actually cared whether I lived or died. Connor reached out slowly and took Victoria's hand, noting how small and cold it felt in his own work-roughened palm. I cared, he admitted. Even when I hated you, I still cared. That's what made the betrayal hurt so much. Victoria's fingers tightened around his, as if his touch was the only thing keeping her anchored to the world. I don't deserve forgiveness, she whispered. I know that. But I need you to know that every moment we spent together was real for me. The coffee conversations, learning guitar, watching you play music for Leo, those were the only times I felt like myself instead of just a corporate logo. Then don't waste them, Connor said firmly. Don't let the board's manipulation turn you into someone who gives up. Fight back. Victoria's eyes opened, focusing on his face with something that looked like hope. How? I'm trapped in a system that punishes any sign of human weakness. Connor squeezed her hand, surprised by his own determination. Then we change the system. Together. The word together seemed to startle both of them, implying a future neither had dared to imagine. But as they looked at each other in the sterile hospital room, something new began to take shape between them. Not the naive friendship of their earlier meetings, but something stronger and more honest. 6 months later, Connor sat in his familiar spot on the Central Park bench, watching Leo chase pigeons with the same enthusiasm he'd shown before their world had fallen apart. The guitar in Connor's hands was the same Martin he'd almost sold, returned to him through a charitable donation that had appeared in his mailbox without explanation. He'd started playing in coffee shops again, small gigs that brought in modest income, but more importantly, reminded him who he was beneath the uniform and the survival mode that had consumed him for months. A familiar figure approached along the path, moving with less confidence than the Victoria Sterling who'd once commanded boardrooms and charity galas. She carried a small canvas bag and wore jeans that actually looked like they'd been worn before, her hair loose and natural rather than styled into corporate perfection. Connor didn't look up from his guitar, but he shifted slightly on the bench, making room for her to sit if she chose to. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, an invitation without pressure, an acknowledgement of her presence without demand for explanation. Victoria sat down carefully, leaving space between them but close enough that Connor could smell her shampoo. Something simple and floral that was nothing like the expensive perfumes she'd worn during their earlier encounters. From her bag, she withdrew a notebook filled with handwritten music, pages covered with chord progressions and lyrics that showed evidence of extensive revision and refinement. "I've been writing," she said simply, not looking at Connor but speaking to the air between them. "Songs, mostly. Terrible songs about making mistakes and trying to find courage you didn't know you had." Leo spotted Victoria and ran over with uncomplicated joy, his face lighting up as if she were a favorite aunt returning from a long trip. "Victoria, did you hear Dad playing? He's been practicing new songs every day." The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and Victoria smiled. Not the polished CEO expression Connor remembered, but something genuine and unguarded. "I did hear him. He sounds wonderful." She looked at Connor for the first time since arriving. "Better than before, actually. There's something different in the music." Connor nodded slowly, understanding what she meant. Pain had changed his songwriting, adding depth and complexity that success and happiness alone couldn't provide. "I have something for you," Victoria said, pulling a single sheet of music from her notebook. "It's not very good, and I probably got the chord progressions wrong, but..." She handed Connor a song titled "The Space Between Us," written in careful handwriting that showed the patience of someone learning a completely new language. Connor studied the notes and lyrics, recognizing Victoria's story woven through verses about glass towers and golden prisons, about learning that love required risking everything you thought protected you. "This is beautiful," he said quietly. "And the chord progressions are actually quite sophisticated." Victoria flushed with pleasure at the compliment, looking younger than her 35 years. "I've been taking lessons. Turns out there are teachers who make house calls for students who can't leave their circumstances." Connor understood the coded language. Victoria was still trapped in her corporate obligations, still bound by contracts and family expectations that prevented her from living freely. But she was finding small rebellions, creating pockets of authenticity within the constraints of her inherited life. It wasn't the dramatic escape that movies promised, but it was progress measured in careful steps rather than grand gestures. "Would you..." Connor hesitated, then decided to trust the fragile peace they'd built. "Would you like to play it together? Your song?" Victoria's eyes widened with surprise, and something that looked like nervous excitement. "I'm not good enough yet. I'll probably mess up the timing." Connor smiled, the first completely natural expression he'd given her since the hospital. "Everyone messes up the timing at first. That's how you learn to find the rhythm that works for you, instead of trying to follow someone else's beat." They spent the next hour working through Victoria's song, Connor playing the primary melody, while Victoria attempted the simpler chord progressions she'd written for herself. She was right about messing up the timing, but Connor was patient, counting beats aloud and adjusting his own playing to accommodate her learning pace. Leo provided enthusiastic, if not entirely accurate, percussion by clapping along, his joy infectious enough to make both adults laugh when Victoria's fingers fumbled particularly badly on a chord change. As the afternoon light began to fade, Victoria packed her notebook away with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to treasure small, precious things. "I have to go," she said, but without the urgency that had always marked her departures during their earlier friendship. "Board meeting at 7. We're discussing the expansion of the educational foundation." Connor nodded, understanding that her obligations hadn't disappeared, but that she was finding ways to use her position for purposes that felt meaningful rather than just profitable. "Victoria," Connor said as she stood to leave. She turned back, eyebrows raised in question. "Same time next week, if you want to keep working on the song?" The invitation was casual, but carried weight they both recognized. Victoria's smile was soft and genuine. "I'd like that, if you're sure you don't mind teaching a very slow student." Connor looked at Leo, who was still chasing pigeons with endless optimism, then back at Victoria. "Everyone deserves a chance to make music," he said, "especially people who've never been allowed to try." Victoria walked away through the golden afternoon light, her steps lighter than they'd been in months. Connor watched her go, then looked down at the song she'd written. The lyrics spoke of distances that couldn't be measured in miles, of learning to build bridges across differences that seemed impossible to span. It wasn't a love song in any traditional sense, but it was something perhaps more valuable. A song about two people learning to see each other clearly, despite the barriers that circumstances had built between them. As Connor played through Victoria's melody one more time, Leo settled beside him on the bench, resting his head against his father's shoulder with the casual affection that made everything else worthwhile. "Dad, do you like Victoria?" the boy asked with characteristic directness. Connor considered the question seriously, watching the spot where Victoria had disappeared around a bend in the path. "I think I'm learning to," he answered honestly. "Sometimes the best things take time to understand properly." The music drifted across the park as evening approached, a simple melody that spoke of second chances and the courage required to remain open to possibility, even after experiencing profound disappointment. It wasn't a perfect song, and it wouldn't change the world, but it was honest in a way that felt rare and valuable. Connor played until the last light faded, then packed his guitar and walked home with Leo, carrying Victoria's music and the quiet hope that some bridges, once built, could bear the weight of two people brave enough to meet in the middle. In the distance, the Sterling Corporation building rose into the Manhattan sky like a monument to power and ambition. But somewhere within its glass and steel walls, a woman sat writing songs about finding her voice, and for the first time in her adult life, the building felt less like a prison and more like a place where she was learning to be free.